So one thing that caught my attention in the second half of the book was when she compares what she calls real art making compared to the MFA program. And so she kind of contradicts herself a little bit because she says how trash the MFA program is and how you shouldn't go to it, but also how it's the only way to make it big if that's what your end goal is. And so I kind of wanted to compare what she says the MFA program does to Michigan State. And one thing that she says is the process of going to school, the admission selection, and the high costs is itself an enormous filter. And I think that's true for Michigan State. You have to have the right GPA, the right SAT scores. You have to have the money to be able to attend institutions like this. And so that was kind of ironic to see how she compares a school that she's kind of trashing to an institution that we're all attending. And then she also says that some MFA students and recent grads become focused on the concept of mainstream success that is predicated on the repetition of what is already known. So here I think she's kind of saying that people only go to these institutions because they're prestigious. And it's well known, like in Michigan, you have U of M and you have Michigan State. It's those prestigious colleges that make you well known. And for her, in her context, it's the MFA. And for us, it's going to Michigan State or going to U of M. And so here I think it's nice to make a connection, especially at our age, to how she's describing these institutions that people can't get a hold of, but what they need to make it big. And so it's kind of ironic to see her kind of trashing institutions like that are very similar to what we're attending. So another thing I want to touch on when it comes to her talking about teaching and schooling is on page 104, she starts to discuss that she can tell whose artwork or whose work came from what professor or what teacher. And to me, that's kind of interesting because it does show that it's repetition, it happens, the same person, the same views, that's what that student gets out of it. So I think this is what made kind of the drama world back then so terrible in her eyes, that she saw the same stuff coming from the same people every single time, and she didn't think that students were allowed to necessarily get what they, or create what they wanted to. And I think that kind of also applies to us in a way. If you have a class and you're forced to study something, or you're forced, like for us, like we're forced to read books, or we're forced to write essays the way a professor wants it. It's kind of like saying, this is how you need to think because this is how I want you to think. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but if that's all you get and you never get that opportunity to kind of think outside of the box in the way you want to, that's what causes these things to become so boring. And for her, this was the drama world. Like, theater just became so boring because it was repetition. It was students coming out of these same professors doing the same stuff. So I think that was kind of interesting to see how she puts in that she notices who comes from what professors, and she could label after seeing someone's art that, oh yeah, this was her professor. And so that was something that I really wanted to address as well. With the women's rights activist side of Sarah Schulman, she also says one quote on page 162 that says, "Yet at the same time that women apparently have broken all barriers, a disobedient female is still considered antisocial, a drag, and a bitch." And this is a quote that I strongly agree with. That's why I'm addressing it. Just because it's still something we see in society. I think this book was written in 2012. And, I mean, it's 7 years later, and we're still seeing women being labeled as a bitch just because they are breaking the barriers that men have put up. And so I think this was really cool seeing this side of her because this is something that I'm very passionate about. So seeing her talk about this was very intriguing for me. She goes on to say that on page 163, women cannot advance unless men are also advancing. And I also find this true just because you've never seen someone advance, women in particular, without men also advancing. For example, like in politics right now, you see a bunch more women in the government, but you still see men taking those steps into deciding what's right for women and what's wrong for women's bodies. And I think that's something here, and I kind of wondered what Sarah Schulman thinks about this now. Obviously, this was 7 years ago, so she doesn't know what's coming. But I've been wondering what she thinks about this, and I think it'd be interesting for her to kind of follow up on, like, these quotes that she says. Because I think when she says women cannot advance unless men are also advancing is kind of contradicting just today's world, just because lately we're seeing so much strong women activists that are changing the government in politics today, that it's hard to see where men are even competing at this point, just because we have taken over a lot of it nowadays. Obviously, we're still the minorities, but I think we're advancing a lot more than the men are in today's world. To touch on one other person's vlog from this week, I wanted to touch on Casey Sherwood's vlog. This was her second vlog this week. But when she talks about gentrification of the mind, which is something I discussed in this week's vlog, she says how people who went to New York to create this art made something out of nothing. And I think this kind of goes along with my vlog that I'm gonna post today, where you aren't something unless you get the proper attention and the proper schooling that was necessary for you to even get noticed at that point in time. And she says how it kind of pointed society in a whole different direction, and that's something I definitely agree with. People were having a hard time trying to get into those schools to finally become something, and even when they did, it was hard for them to stick with it, or it was hard for them to be able to afford it, or to be able to outshine those who they were also with. And so I thought it was kind of cool how Casey also touched on something that I found super interesting in the second half of the book. And yeah.